That's the number I want you to hold in your mind. Not a vague era or a broad historical window, a single year in that year. 3 major expeditions, American, British, and French, sailed toward the same remote destination, Antarctica. And they didn't arrive centuries apart or even decades apart. They reached the frozen continent within months of one another. For a long time, I accepted the explanation without question. It seemed logical. The early 19th century was the height of the age of exploration. Nations were racing to map the unknown, claim territory, and expand scientific knowledge. Parallel expeditions made sense, but then I came across something that made me pause, buried deep inside a footnote of Charles Wilkes. Expedition Records was a single line, 7 words that had been removed from the official publication of his report. The original phrase purportedly described formations inconsistent with any natural process known. 7 words, quietly removed. At first, that kind of thing might seem trivial. Historical records are edited all the time. Explorers misinterpret geological features, scientists correct earlier assumptions, and governments simplify complicated reports before publication. But the deeper I looked into these Antarctic expeditions, the more often I began to notice small omissions like this. And then another strange account appeared decades later, nearly 50 years after those early expeditions. A survivor from one of the first Antarctic overwinter missions, an expedition led by Norwegian-British explorer Carsten Borchgreving, gave a single interview. In that interview, he described something unsettling, according to the translated version published decades later. Several crew members believed they could see the outlines of structures beneath the ice. Cities, not clearly visible buildings, but shapes, patterns, something organized beneath the frozen surface. What made the story stranger was that this section of the interview was not translated into English. For almost 60 years, that was the moment I stopped being able to look away from this timeline. So let's step back and examine the historical record as carefully as we can, because before we explore theories or speculation, we need to understand what actually happened during those expeditions. The first of the 3 was led by Charles Wilkes, an American naval officer. Wilkes departed in August 1838, commanding a squadron of 6 ships. Over the course of his expedition, his crew charted more than 1,500 miles of Antarctic coastline. By the time he returned in 1842, his journey was considered a major geographic achievement, but there was a problem. His report was disputed almost immediately, not by rival nations, but by members of his own crew. Some officers argued that Wilkes' official charts and logs did not match what they had personally recorded during the voyage. Private letters later recovered by historians suggested that several crew members believed important observations had been left out of the official report. The controversy followed Wilkes for years. He faced multiple court-martials later in his career officially for disciplinary issues involving his crew. He was acquitted of most charges, but the result was the same. His reputation faded, and his Antarctic findings slowly slipped into bureaucratic obscurity. And Wilkes' expedition was only the beginning, because almost at the same time, 2 other powerful nations were exploring the same frozen coastline. While Charles Wilkes was charting large sections of Antarctic coastline for the United States, another expedition was already moving south from Europe. This one was led by the French naval officer Jules Dumont d'Urville. De Ville departed from Toulon in September 1837 with a mission that combined national ambition and scientific curiosity. France, like Britain and the United States, wanted a presence in the last unexplored regions of the planet. The expedition's official goals were clear: push farther south than previous French voyages, conduct scientific observations, and claim new territory for France. In January 1840, his ships sighted land along the Antarctic coast. De Ville named the region Adélie after his wife Adele. The discovery secured his place in exploration history, and his reports were widely published across Europe. Unlike Wilkes, De Ville returned home celebrated. His expedition seemed straightforward: successful navigation, new charts, scientific observations, and a symbolic territorial claim. For most historians, the story ends there. But 2 years later, something tragic happened. In May 1842, Dumont d'Urville boarded a train near Versailles with his wife and young son. During the journey, the train derailed and caught fire. The accident became one of the worst railway disasters of the 19th century. D'Urville, his wife, and their son all died in the crash. What makes this detail noteworthy isn't simply the tragedy itself. Accidents happen, and the early days of rail travel were notoriously dangerous. But according to several historical notes, D'Urville had been traveling with documents related to his Antarctic expedition. Some of those materials were reportedly being transported for review and publication. Much of it was destroyed in the fire. Now it's important to be careful here. A tragic accident does not automatically imply hidden motives or lost secrets. History is full of coincidences that look suspicious only when viewed decades later. Still, when examining the larger timeline of Antarctic exploration, this moment becomes another curious fragment in a much bigger puzzle. Because while Wilkes and D'Urville were exploring the Antarctic coastline, a third expedition was pushing even farther south. This one was led by the British naval officer James Clark Ross. Ross was already famous before his Antarctic journey. He had discovered the North Magnetic Pole during earlier Arctic expeditions, and he was considered one of the most experienced polar explorers of his time. When he sailed south in 1839, he commanded 2 specially reinforced ships. The HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror. Ross would go on to discover some of the most famous landmarks in Antarctica, including the massive Ross Ice Shelf, a towering wall of ice stretching hundreds of miles across the horizon. In his official reports, Ross described the formation with typical Victorian scientific restraint: vast, imposing, and completely impassable. But later, researchers who examined the original crew logs noticed something unusual. Certain descriptions from individual officers never appeared in the published accounts. Some of those private journals mentioned strange geometric patterns in exposed rock formations along the Antarctic coast, formations that seemed unusually regular, almost structured. One officer even described what he called stone surfaces meeting at unnatural right angles. These comments were brief and often vague, yet similar remarks appeared in more than one personal account. And when historians compared the raw journals with the official reports submitted to the British Admiralty, they discovered that some passages had simply never been included in the public narrative on their own. These differences might seem insignificant, but when 3 separate expeditions from 3 different nations begin to show similar patterns of missing details, the story becomes harder to ignore. And that's where the mystery surrounding Antarctica begins to deepen. Nearly half a century after those first major expeditions, Antarctica was still one of the least understood places on Earth. Ships had approached its coastline. Explorers had mapped sections of its icy edge, but very few people had actually set foot on the continent itself. That changed in 1895, when a group connected to a Norwegian whaling expedition managed to land on the Antarctic mainland. Among them was a Norwegian-British explorer named Carsten Borchgrevink. For the first time, humans were not just observing Antarctica from ships, they were standing on it. Borchgrevink would later return with a dedicated scientific mission known as the Southern Cross Expedition, which took place between 1898 and 1900. His team became the first group to deliberately spend the winter in Antarctica, enduring months of darkness, extreme cold, and complete isolation. The expedition produced a great deal of scientific information, biological samples, meteorological data, and observations about the environment of the continent. These details appear clearly in the official records, but once again, certain descriptions seem to become strangely vague whenever the conversation turns to the geology of the land itself. Borchgrevink was normally a precise writer. In his reports he carefully documented the movement of ice, the behavior of wildlife, and the daily logistics of surviving in such an extreme environment. Yet, when he wrote about the rock formations exposed where winds had scoured away the ice, his language became noticeably different. The descriptions became more abstract, almost poetic. In several passages from his private correspondence, sentences describing the formations stop abruptly or shift suddenly to a different subject. In other cases, the wording in his personal letters does not match the version later submitted to his expedition sponsors. It's a small detail, but it appears more than once. One member of Borchgrevink's expedition, the zoologist Nikolai Hansen, died during the mission at the age of just 29, officially. His death was attributed to illness related to digestive complications. He was buried on a ridge overlooking the bay near the expedition camp, becoming the first person ever buried in Antarctica. Most historical accounts devote only a brief paragraph to his death. Another member of the expedition returned home and spent the rest of his life refusing to speak publicly about what he experienced during the mission. But in 1903, he gave one interview to a Norwegian newspaper. That interview included a curious phrase describing what the journalist translated as episodes of geographic fixation. According to the account, some members of the expedition became convinced they could see organized shapes beneath the ice, patterns that appeared unnatural. Not everyone agreed with these interpretations. Other crew members believed the sightings were caused by optical illusions, particularly a well-known polar phenomenon called Fata Morgana, where distant objects appear distorted or magnified by atmospheric conditions. Such mirages can create the illusion of towers, cliffs, or entire cities rising above the horizon. Explorers in both the Arctic and Antarctic have reported these effects for centuries, so the rational explanation is straightforward. Isolation, extreme weather, and unusual light conditions can easily distort human perception. But here's what makes these accounts interesting. The descriptions recorded in private journals and letters are not random. The shapes that crew members believed they saw were often described with remarkably similar characteristics: large-scale, stone-like surfaces, patterns resembling grids or aligned walls rather than natural formations, and these descriptions appear not just in Borchgrevink's expedition, but in scattered notes from earlier voyages as well, which raises an intriguing question. If these sightings were purely illusions, why do the descriptions share such consistent details across different expeditions and decades? That question leads us to another part of the mystery, one that lies not in human perception, but in the physical landscape of Antarctica itself. To understand why these early explorers were so fascinated and sometimes unsettled by what they saw, we need to look more closely at the geology of Antarctica itself. Many people imagine Antarctica as a continent completely buried beneath ice. In reality, that picture isn't entirely accurate. Across the continent, there are exposed regions of rock known as nunataks, mountain peaks and ridges that rise above the surrounding ice sheet. In other areas, powerful winds sweep away layers of snow, revealing sections of the bare Antarctic surface. These exposed areas gave early explorers their first direct glimpse of the continent's geological structure, and according to several expedition accounts from the 19th century, some of those formations appeared unusual. Different explorers used different wording, but the same themes appeared repeatedly in their journals: unexpected regularity, sharply defined edges, and surfaces that seemed to form right angles rather than the irregular shapes normally created by erosion. One crew member wrote that certain formations seemed to occur in repeating intervals, almost as if the rock had been arranged in patterns rather than scattered randomly across the landscape. Another journal described stone that, in the author's words, did not fracture in the way ordinary rock should. Of course, geologists have explanations for many formations that might appear artificial at first glance. Certain volcanic rocks, such as columnar basalt, naturally break into regular geometric shapes. These formations can produce hexagonal columns and straight edges that sometimes resemble man-made structures. Other processes, like frost wedging or differential erosion, can also produce surprisingly symmetrical rock patterns. So from a scientific perspective, there are perfectly reasonable natural explanations for what explorers may have observed, but here is the detail that keeps appearing in multiple expedition records. It isn't simply the presence of unusual rock formations, it's their distribution. When researchers later compared the approximate locations described in different journals, they noticed that the reports did not all refer to the same geological site. Instead, these observations were scattered across different parts of the Antarctic coastline, sometimes hundreds of miles apart. If the formations were simply a single unique geological feature, that would be easy to explain. But similar descriptions appeared in multiple regions, recorded by explorers who had never met each other and had no opportunity to coordinate their accounts. And this is where the historical mystery becomes harder to dismiss entirely, because the geological observations weren't the only thing that seemed to disappear from the official record. Several expeditions also experienced delays, edits, or partial publication of their reports. For example, the United States government did not immediately publish all of Charles Wilkes' Antarctic charts. Some documents were delayed or reclassified for years before becoming publicly accessible. Similarly, the British Admiralty received James Clark Ross's full expedition logs, but portions of the officer's private records were not catalogued or widely studied until much later in the 20th century. French historians have also noted that the published narrative of Dumont d'Urville's expedition differs in subtle ways from surviving crew diaries. Interestingly, the discrepancies often involve the same type of detail: descriptions of rock formations and interior geological features, rather than navigation or scientific measurements. That doesn't necessarily mean anything extraordinary was discovered. Governments sometimes edited exploration reports for practical reasons, national security, territorial disputes, or simply to simplify complicated scientific descriptions for publication. But the pattern is still worth noting. 3 different nations, 3 major expeditions within the same decade. And in each case, certain observations about the Antarctic landscape appear to have been quietly minimized or delayed. Whether that pattern is coincidence or something more remains an open question, and that question becomes even more intriguing when we consider another category of historical evidence: ancient maps that may have shown Antarctica long before these expeditions ever arrived. The mystery surrounding Antarctica becomes even more intriguing when we shift from expedition journals to something older: historical maps. Several maps created centuries before the great Antarctic expeditions appear to show landmasses in the far southern hemisphere with surprising detail. 2 examples are often discussed in alternative historical research: the Peary race map of 1513 and the Orent's Fine World Map from 1531. The Ottoman Admiral Peary Reis wrote that his famous map was not created entirely from his own observations. Instead, he compiled it from much older source charts, some of which he claimed dated back hundreds or even thousands of years. What makes this interesting is that parts of the map seem to depict a southern landmass with coastlines that some researchers believe resemble Antarctica's subglacial topography, the actual rock surface beneath the ice sheet. Supporters of this idea argue that the map appears to show the continent without its modern ice cover, something that modern scientists were only able to study centuries later using radar and sonar technology. However, mainstream historians usually offer a simpler explanation. They believe the shapes on the Peary race map likely represent distorted versions of South America or other poorly understood coastlines that early cartographers were still trying to interpret. In other words, the resemblance to Antarctica might simply be a coincidence created by imperfect mapping techniques. Still, the existence of these early maps raises an interesting question. How much did earlier civilizations actually know about the southern oceans? Sailors had been exploring the seas for thousands of years before the 19th century. Phoenician traders, Chinese navigators, Arab merchants, and European explorers all contributed pieces to the growing picture of the world's geography. It's possible that fragments of knowledge about distant southern lands circulated long before Antarctica was officially documented, and if even partial, information survived through copied maps and lost charts. It might explain why certain coastlines seemed familiar when 19th century explorers finally reached them, but Antarctica still holds enormous secrets. Today, modern radar and satellite imaging have revealed entire mountain ranges, valleys, and lakes hidden beneath the ice sheet. One of the most famous discoveries is Lake Vostok, a massive body of liquid water buried under nearly 4 kilometers of ice. Scientists believe Antarctica's subglacial landscape may contain thousands of such lakes and complex geological structures, many of which remain only partially mapped. So far, no confirmed archaeological structures have been found beneath the ice, yet the continent is still one of the least explored environments on Earth, harsh weather, logistical challenges, and the sheer scale of the ice sheet make detailed exploration extremely difficult. When we step back and look at the entire story, from the simultaneous expeditions of the 1840s, to the strange gaps in historical reports, to the curious interpretations of early maps, it becomes clear why Antarctica continues to capture the imagination of researchers and explorers alike. Perhaps the unusual formations described by early sailors were simply unfamiliar geology. Perhaps the strange sightings were optical illusions created by polar light. Or perhaps Antarctica still hides discoveries that future generations will uncover as technology improves. For now, the frozen continent remains one of Earth's last great mysteries, and sometimes the most powerful discoveries in history begin with a simple question. What did those early explorers really see when they first looked across the Antarctic ice?